Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be talking about the Bradley Beal contract buyout with the Phoenix Suns and his signing with the Los Angeles Clippers. So, let's get it started. Let's talk about the good with Bradley Beal. I always like talking about, what's good about this player rather than, start off with the bad. And let's start, his stats, 17 points a game, but he did shoot, 38% from three. And overall, that's not the worst stats you could, get, but it's just that $110 million contract and that no trade clause that's really hurting his name around the league and saying he's nowhere near worth that, especially the no trade clause. That's what's getting everyone's, attention, because if you didn't have that, people would just say, okay, he's regressing, but he's still a really good starter in this league. Maybe I could see him coming off the bench if he's willing to do that, but he's clearly not, because the Suns tried that and it just didn't work for both parties. And overall, I still think Bradley Bill is a starting shooting guard in this league. I mean, his stats are 17 points a game, shot 49% from the field goal and 38% from three, and he's been relatively healthy. He hasn't had a major injury that we're kind of seen with, on the wrong age of 30, guards or small guards, especially like we saw with Dame or even his former teammate John Wall. And those are like major, basically career ending injuries. And we still haven't seen that. And hopefully we don't see that with Bradley Bill, because at the end of the day, he didn't really rely on his athleticism. He relies more of his, skill with the ball in his hands. And that's why it really didn't work with the Phoenix Suns, because he needs to have ball in his hands. When you have Devin Booker and Kevin Durant, especially a guy like Kevin Durant, he is a number one option on any team in the league. Even on the Houston Rockets, he's going to be a number one option, and he's going to be, 37 years old when the season, starts. That's how good of an offensive player Kevin Durant is. And no disrespect to Bradley Beal, but you're just not in that Kevin Durant type of player, not a future Hall of Famer. He's a really good player. He's an all star. Maybe an all NBA type player, but that's kind of in his past now. And I think he needs to look forward to, you know, being more of a team player. And I know the Suns wanted him to be more of that, Drew Holiday type player, and he kind of took it as, a disrespect, saying, well, I'm not Drew Holiday, I'm Bradley Bill. And they're not saying, hey, play defense every possession of the court, and that's all you're gonna do, and then you could score whenever Kevin Durant and Devin Booker are. That's not what they meant. What they meant was, hey, you need to try more defensively on the defensive end of the court. Can you get more involved? And if you get more involved, you could probably score off of basically locking someone up. And I think the Suns and Bradley Bill are happy to depart ways, as you can see with Bradley Bill's Instagram post. Instead of doing that, hey, thank you for taking the chance on me, trading for me. I love the city, I love the fans. Kind of like when Kevin Durant put out on social media, even though Kevin Durant had a, I think, a misspelled word and people kind of clowned him for it, he still posted a goodbye message toward the organization and the fan base. Bradley Bill, on the other hand, kind of just put the peace emojis, and that kind of showed you what type of relationship they had. It was just a sour taste, and I think they were both just happy to get rid of each other. And I think what sealed the deal for this contract buyout was the Kevin Durant trade, because in a sense you're bringing in someone who's in the same position as Bradley Bill, and you're willing to take that loss and say, hey, well, y'all play the same position, but this guy's younger. He has more upside. He, helped the Houston Rockets become the number two seed. Yes, his playoff inconsistency is a real issue, but we're willing to take that chance. And you're also bringing in a 3-and-D player, Dylan Brooks. He's a pest on defense. He loves talking trash to star players. And you're saying, hey, this is a better option than just Bradley Bill on this Phoenix Suns roster. Because you also do have Grayson Allen, who y'all extended for that 4 year, $72 million deal. And I think it's going to be really hard to move on from that too. So you're probably going to have to play him at least for this season and maybe the one after, until a team kind of says, hey, I'm willing to give you a expiring contract and a couple second round picks, or a young player that didn't just work out. And you also have Ryan Dunn, who showed promise in the summer league last year in his 3-point shot, but now he kind of struggled in the regular season. And yeah, I think he could still be a 3-and-D player. If not, I think his defensive ability is still going to translate, and I think that's what you really need on this roster, obviously. And you still have Colin Gillespie, who who a lot of Phoenix Suns fans love, and he kind of does remind me of a TJ McCollum type. That spark off the bench that you need, and you really want that nowadays because his ball handling is really good, and I think his shot selection's good. He doesn't really force anything because he knows that he's on the court for a limited amount of time, and if he starts making the right plays, the right passes, dive for the ball, that he's going to stay on the court more, and that's what you want and need now that Bradley Bill's gone because you need these players that are willing to play a role, this team first mentality to like, hey, I need to give Jalen Green the ball, I need to give Devin Booker the ball, even Ryan Dunn, Grayson Allen, all these players the ball. Let me do a lob to Kamal Mali watch, and I think Colin Gillespie could do that. I don't know if he could be a starter in this league, but I think he could be a really good spark off the bench. And I still think Bradley Bill's a starter in this league, and a lot of people are just kind of overreacting in a sense because yes, he was getting paid $110 million and he had that no trade clause, and that's the reason why no one wanted to trade for him or even attempt to bring him on your team without him being bought out. And people need to realize it's hard playing with two other ball dominant players. I mean, you have Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant's going to be a number one option on every team he goes basically, except maybe a few, like a handful. I would say maybe three or four teams. You could say the Thunder, you could say the Spurs, the Celtics, and maybe one or two other teams, not too sure, but Kevin Durant was going to be the number one option, and Devin Booker had to be the number two option because he led the team to the NBA Finals with Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton and Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson. That team was a really good team, and he was 2 games away from the NBA Finals. You can't just say, "Hey, you're going to take a back seat now," because he's already taken a back seat and being the number two option and letting Kevin Durant kind of run the show. So Bradley Bill had to be that third option, and clearly it just wasn't in Bradley Bill's game to be a third option. He has to be a scoring second option because he doesn't affect the game any other way. He can't really play make as much as you would like, and he can't play the point guard and get others involved, and he can't play defense like how I guess you wanted him to be. And that's just not his game. He's a scoring shooting guard that could handle the ball, and if he's not scoring, he's not really affecting the game as well as you would like. And a prime example of this is against the Boston Celtics. I think this was one of his worst games. He finished only with 4 points and, 1 from 7 from the field. And it was just overall not a Bradley Beal game, even by his standards. And the Clippers, I think, won this buyout overall just because, you get a top, 30 player in the league still for, a 2 year, $11 million contract. And this is what you need because you trade Norman Powell away for the Heat, but you bring in, a similar person and he's not making that $110 million anymore. And you could still, trade him. And I think a lot of teams will still trade for him because he's on that really cheap deal. I don't think they'll trade him. And then you still also have, your superstar, Kawhi Leonard. And yes, a big thing is on him is health. Can he be healthy? Can he make it to the playoff? And I don't think so, but can he play, 55 to 65 games and y'all make, the third or fourth seed and then come back in the playoffs and kind of dominate and carry the load for the most part? That's still up in the air, but you still have James Harden too, who I think is a natural point guard. I mean, he's shown it since the Houston Rockets day when he was still scoring 30 and 10, and then the Brooklyn Nets, and then the Sixers is kind of where he kind of broke out, passing the ball more to Joel Embiid. And overall, I still like him playing the point guard. And then you bring in Chris Paul back to LA. Obviously, him and James Harden has some history going back to the Rockets days, but Chris Paul played all 82 games last year. He's still a really good player. I like him off the bench. And then you still have Zubac, who I think is a really underrated center. Obviously, he's not going to be someone who's going to space the floor. And yeah, defensively, I think he's still not the best rim protector, but he's not the worst. And you just need someone who can, get a double double. And I believe he could do that still. And an underrated signing, in my opinion, was the Brook Lopez because, yes, he's not that championship, 2021 Brook Lopez that, was a rim protector and he was scoring, almost 16 points a game and, spacing the floor as much and making them. But he can still space the floor, still rim protect. Now, can he play less minutes, 24, 25 minutes and, impact the game? I think he can, especially off the bench. I really don't see them playing, together as much, Zubac and Brook Lopez. And you still have, Derek Jones, who I really like because, he's this 3-and-D player and that spark off the bench where he's, dunking these putback dunks and kind of in the crowd. And, even the team into it. And then you had John Collins, who don't think a lot of people, thought of, but he kind of, raised his name back in the trade market because I think 2 seasons ago he kind of heard it, kind of saying this guy's one dimensional. His scoring's not that, efficient, this, that, and that. But last season he kind of like regained, his confidence and raised his trade value. And I think he's gonna fit in really perfect because when we saw John Collins, I guess you could say prime John Collins was with a natural passer, Trey Young, and now you add one James Harden. But you also got to think of the people they brought back too. Nick Batum, who's a 3-and-D player. I think he's still could impact the game maybe for one more season. I believe he's going to be there. And then you have Amir Coffey, who's a 3-and-D player. I believe he almost shot 38%, even in the high 40% from three. And then you have a point guard Chris Dunn, who's just a defensive, menace and not really there for offense, but that's what you need. You need more of a defensive, pest in a sense. And then you have Bozan Bogdanovic, who obviously is that, 3-point sniper that could still come off the bench and score, 12, 14 points, fill in if Kawhi is hurt. And I think this team is going to be a really underrated team, in my opinion. And I'm just super excited to see this Bradley Bill, Kawhi Leonard, and James Harden team. Overall, I still think this team's maybe a third to fourth seed just because I don't trust Kawhi Leonard regular season to be available. And obviously, you need your star player or, number two player to be available to make that, higher seed. But I'm super excited for this team. I'm excited for the regular season. But let me know what you think, guys, about this, buyout. But yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.